Walter Russell Mead has to come to India every now and then because he's the Curry Fellow at the Hudson Institute. And just for that alone, he comes in. But of course, he's coming in at a perfect time for us because he is an expert on American foreign policy, and in particular the, should we say, ideological strands of American foreign policy, and he's particularly good at connecting it with American domestic politics. And we've just had a major U.S. election and a school of American foreign policy that he identified, the Jacksonians, of which Donald Trump is right now the only representative, I guess, in the White House, has just come back to power. And from what I can tell, he's going to be ultra-Jacksonian this time. So tell us, what do you see are the, looking at the appointments that he's already made, statements that he's already said on the world, what do you see, what are the contours of a second Donald Trump presidency as far as the world is concerned?
Well, it's going to be interesting. Trump is, I think we're going to see a less ideological American foreign policy. And when President Biden looks at the world, he sees a contest between authoritarian powers and democratic powers. When Trump looks at the world, I think he sees friends and enemies, allies of the United States and adversaries of the United States, and cares much less about the political orientation, authoritarianism, or anything like that of potential partners. And this is a strain in American foreign policy that's actually been around for a long time, that a lot of Americans don't really care very much about whether foreigners believe in one God, 50 gods, no God, whether they have democracy, absolute monarchy, theocracy. As long as they don't attack the United States, we don't care what they do. And you can see that idea very much, I think, in both in Trump's appointments and in some of his early decisions about personnel. That said, there are a couple of exceptions. One would be Israel. And we should note here again that it's actually not opinion among American Jews that tends to drive American policy toward Israel. American Jews, yet again, did not vote for Trump, although he got more votes this time than he has in the past. It is both evangelical Christians and others who see in Israel a kind of a sign of really, they see Israel as just an inherent ally for a mix of political and religious reasons. And we've seen that very strongly in his early appointments.
So I'm looking at some of the present hotspots in the world, whether it is Israel, you've mentioned already. I think what you're signaling is that there's American support for Israel is not going to wane at all, especially now that it's become a Iran versus Israel rather than necessarily just a Palestinian versus Israel conflict. But we're also, one of the other, probably the most nervous government in the world about Trump is Ukraine, because his language on Ukraine has been very clear. He does not think this is a war America should be supporting, or at least funding.
Yeah, and here, I think it's important to look a little bit under the hood, that if we look at what this sort of Schultz-Biden policy on Ukraine has been, it is not a policy about helping Ukraine win the war. They're too worried that Russia might escalate in response to too much Western support for Ukraine. So the idea has been to kind of keep Ukraine fighting, prevent a collapse, but after a certain period of time, the Ukrainians will get themselves tired of fighting a war that they can't win and will come to Putin asking for some kind of a support. And I think the Trump idea here is, well, you know, if Ukraine is going to lose the war anyway, why should we spend $200 billion trying to... Now, I think where both Trump and Biden are likely to have problems is I don't think Vladimir Putin is looking to give the West or Ukraine an easy off-ramp off the war. His intention, his goal in the war is not simply about Ukraine, it's about weakening NATO, it's about dividing the Europeans from the United States. And I don't think he's going to want to give up the war until he feels that he's gotten about as much progress in that direction as he can get.
So if we were to then turn to this part of the world, you have a Indo-Pacific, you have a Quad, which Trump was as enthusiastic about as Biden has been. In fact, there's been remarkable consistency, I would argue, on the East Asian and South Asian front between the two administrations. But there are some points of contention. Trump has argued that he wants all allies or people to pay their way, and so at least on Taiwan, he's been a little bit wobbly. Though I think if he just wants them to give more money after that, he doesn't seem to care. And every now and then he has a strange policy on China. It is bad, it is good, but it is bad, but maybe I can do a deal with them. Where do we see the China policy in the second Trump administration going to be like?
Well, I think he will not close the door on some kind of grand bargain with China. But again, I think it's much easier to have a big, bright picture in your head about a grand bargain with China than it is to actually work out the details. So I would be surprised to see that actually happening, though I think given the state of the Chinese economy, there's probably more disposition in Beijing to explore that road than maybe there would have been a couple of years ago or when Trump was last in office. But you're right that probably the area in American foreign policy where there's the greatest degree of bipartisan consensus is on Indo-Pacific policy, and that would mean both India and China. That I think Trump will be supportive of the Quad. I think he'll be very supportive of the relationship with India. India is not asking the United States for military guarantees. India pays for its own defense budget. So in all those respects, India is much more the kind of associate power that a Trump would be looking for. And India's trade with the United States, and that's also certainly likely to be an issue in a Trump presidency, is much more weighted towards cyber and IT than it is to trade in manufactured goods. And for whatever reason, Trump doesn't seem to have the same sort of protectionist instincts about tech that he does about steel and cars and things of that nature.
So when Trump complains about India's tariffs, which are high, but then he complains about everybody's tariffs, what should be the Indian response? What do you think he would really be looking for?
I think I would say that from an Indian point of view, the place where there's the greatest opportunity with the United States would be in this idea of the creation of a kind of a free world technosphere. That is, whether we like it or not, we can see that the Chinese are building one tech system, and other countries who don't want to be part of that are looking at alternatives. And to see sort of India, Israel, the United States, and the Europeans, I think, would come along into a block of that kind. I think we would see the Saudis and the Emiratis and others getting involved. You have a very powerful, trusted tech alliance. Right. And I think in the rulemaking that would go along in the establishment of that, all of these things so that there's an Indian voice at the table, and also that the system evolves in a way in which India is an integral part of it. That's probably the key opportunity.
I think India's also taken out an insurance policy. If the Indian press is correct, there are now more Trump towers and Trump resorts in India than any other country in the world besides the United States. So when we're looking at we don't yet know Trump's economic team, hasn't really come together yet. But one of the things he seems to be very obsessed about is the strength of the US dollar. And he's denounced moves for de-dollarization by certain economies. For example, within the BRICS, China and Russia have led that. India has been less enthusiastic. But one of the things we do hear is that the Chinese warning that if America does impose sweeping tariffs against China, China will consider renminbi devaluation, which would have huge secondary effects on the rest of the world. How exactly do we see America's, should we say, financial or currency policy play out geopolitically with a Trump administration?
That's a very interesting question, because I think Trump's own instincts about the dollar are conflicted. That on the one hand, he likes a strong dollar as a sign of national prestige and strength, and certainly doesn't want other countries taking action against the dollar. On the other hand, he doesn't like trade deficits. And a high dollar actually means that we get a large flood of imports into the United States. So how he will balance, how policies that both are driving the dollar up and driving the dollar down would actually work out in financial markets, how Trump would then read the signals from those markets and then adjust policy. All of this, I think, is very hard to predict. But I think the idea that we might see a volatile set of conditions in financial markets, for example, that as Trump's spending plans became clearer and many on Wall Street felt that these were unrealistic, we've already seen long-term Treasury interest rates rise with the prospect of Trump coming. That has now gotten so severe in the last couple of days, it seems to have affected stock prices. Trump reads the financial press, and I don't just say this because I write for the Wall Street Journal. Trump is a New Yorker, and financial markets are part of his natural world. He pays attention to what Wall Street thinks about what he's doing. So there's a feedback loop there. We just don't know quite how it's going to work.
I get a sense now of a Trump that will be transactional, but that I don't think is a problem for India. As you mentioned, India does not accept military aid. It doesn't accept much aid, in fact, from anybody. But on one area we have noticed, or we have seen over the past two administrations, including partly the Trump administration, has been the technological relationship that you've mentioned. But what Biden has been very good for India on is the so-called ICET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, where America has been remarkably generous, given that India is not a military ally, a treaty ally of the United States, in giving India access to very high-level defense technology, and basically said, we get that you want to build your own defense equipment, and America is prepared to help you. Would I be right in saying that we should expect Trump to look at that and say, I don't see why the Indians should be getting this technology, given that we spent billions developing it?
I think it's fair to say that what Trump would do is look at that in the context of the broader U.S.-India relationship, and people would have to make an effective case to him that this was in the American interest. There's a quid for the pro quo of some kind. Doesn't necessarily have to be economic. There are lots of ways. Trump, unlike the way most negotiations in international affairs have gone since World War II, really, Trump believes in aggregating things so that you don't just have a trade negotiation that's in isolation from every other piece of your relationship. So I think what one would need to do is think about how the relationship overall is going to look in Trump's eyes, and how does this particular piece of it fit in. I think the countries that have done the best with Trump in the past, and India was very successful in the first term, and I think Trump and Modi managed to work out a good relationship. But often what they do is they come up with a list of things that they have on offer to Trump, as opposed to what I would sometimes hear from our European friends who would come to Washington with a very long list of things they wanted Washington to do for them. But actually, you look at the list of what they wanted to do for Washington, and there was nothing on the list. I think India has a shrewder idea of how to approach these kinds of negotiations.
Yeah, I was once talking to a Japanese diplomat who was working with the previous Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, the late Shinzo Abe, and he said, we quickly realized this is the first Trump presidency, Trump was transactional. So we had been planning to buy a bunch of Tomahawk cruise missiles from America, but we held that back, waited for him to be elected, and then went to him, and he said, what are you going to buy from me? And he said, we'll buy Tomahawks, which they were planning to buy anyway, but Trump was very pleased, and he said, wow, I got you to buy Tomahawks from me. And after that, the relationship went very well. But one of the areas that Indians are nervous about is immigration, because at least illegal migration has been one of the one or two most important issues in this election. He has people in his administration like Steve Miller and his deputy chief staff who were very clear that even legal migration, for example, H-1B visas, in their view, is something America should not be allowing. But of course, immigration, or at least the Indian American community now, has been become one of the strongest links between the U.S. and India. I went to college in America in the early 1980s, and I can say if I said I was an Indian, people would ask me, was I Apache or Navajo? Now they'll ask me whether I'm a Punjabi or a Gujarati. Right. I'm neither. But now there's a knowledge about India that wasn't there before. How much should we be nervous about that?
I think the H-1B visa question, which is really the one that is of the most interest, as I understand it, for Indians, is in a different place from the sort of unguarded or southern border, as many of Trump's supporters would characterize it. And it's important from an Indian point of view, I would suggest, to try to keep those issues separate. And there are people like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, and others who well know from their own experience the value of the H-1B visa program. And I know we were discussing U.S. healthcare and the importance of skilled migrants for that system. So I think the thing to do is to look at the industries that have Trump's ear, whose interests are very much engaged with this. And I don't see any reason, sort of any existential reason why this could not be managed effectively.
So Trump comes he gets sworn in January. Normally, in an American administration, it's really the first sort of 1.5 years where you see the bulk of policy making actually be accomplished. After that, you have a midterm election where almost every president does a little badly and probably lose at least some of their strength in the Congress. So over the next 1.5 years, what do you expect to see coming out of the Trump administration, but not just in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of domestic policy that will probably have international repercussions?
Well, I think a lot of it is likely to be consumed. Again, let's just say when it involves Trump, prediction is even more difficult than it usually is. So please don't play back the footage of this conversation in 6 months and come back at me. But for President Trump, I think he is very, very interested in this business of restructuring the state. I think we should all understand that this is the first battle in something that is likely to be happening globally, that the information revolution is ultimately a gun at the head of bureaucracies. Because what is a bureaucracy? Well, it's really a very crude form of AI in the sense that you have a lot of people applying algorithms to data to come up with standard answers. And a good AI system ought to be able to replace thousands of bureaucrats giving decisions that are faster and more in accordance with the law or the intentions of policymakers. And every corporation, every government around the world is going to be looking at this. And of course, every civil servants union is going to be looking at this too. And so Trump's idea of bringing deep disruption to government is partly about revenge on various forms of the government that he felt treated him unfairly during his first term or between terms. But it is also this idea of a sort of Elon Musk concept. Just as Elon Musk was able to do much more than NASA could do with the money on his rocket program, aren't there ways of doing the state that are cheaper, more efficient, and maybe more policy flexible? That struggle, political struggle that involves, the countless interests that touches on, is a vast kind of sea change that Trump is likely to be trying to push forward. You can look at that Heritage 2025 program. A lot of that is looking at some of these issues. And this is likely to be such an all-consuming political fight, even for Trump. I don't know how much energy there's going to be left for other things. But I would pay attention to this front.
Actually, that's an area where he and Prime Minister Modi could have a long discussion over, because in many ways, I would argue that is at the heart of a lot of what the present Indian Prime Minister has been trying to do.
Honestly,
or has done over the past 10 years.
If the U.S. government could deliver services as effectively as the Indian government does, our bureaucracy would not be happy, but our citizens might be.
So in that case, what we may then see is a foreign policy team that will have actually a remarkable degree of independence as the Prime Minister focuses on his, the President focuses on his internal battles, if you wish, that other than some basic contours or directions. If so, who would we need to be looking out? I mean, who would you be looking out for inside the foreign policy team, much of which seems to have now been assembled over the next 1.5 years?
In general, he seems to have picked a foreign policy team that's more in line with what you could call traditional Republican priorities. And that's quite interesting. And voices that call for some kind of major change, U.S. pulling out of NATO, ignoring the Middle East, so on and so on, at this point have been frozen out. Now, it will be, again, we have to see who does he call into the White House, how much authority is he willing to give these folks, but it looks as if he's starting out with, by Trump's standards, a non-disruptive approach to some of these. Now, again, I would say that the area where there's a potential for real conflict would probably be with Iran, and that a lot of the early energy of the administration is going to be focused on, I think, the Middle East.
So I think with that, I'll just, one last comment from you perhaps. How, should we say, after Trump, would you guess was going to happen in terms of American foreign policy?
After Trump? Oh, that's a big question. I think if you look at United States trade, about a third of it is with the Western Hemisphere, a third of it crosses the Pacific, and a third of it crosses the Atlantic. that would suggest that the United States is going to remain a country which is global in some ways in its thinking, that there will not be regions of the earth that the United States is going to ignore. I think the rise of countries like India we're seeing a world that's going to be more multipolar than in the past. But there's a difference between adversarial multipolarity, say China's contest with the U.S., and sort of competitive multipolarity, where you have a group of countries who broadly accept the framework of the international system, and then each is trying to maximize their own interests within that framework. That's probably where the Americans would like to see it go. My guess is this is also what India would like.